Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will take us into the Eastern Roman Empire / Byzantine Empire, and we are going to learn about the Empress Theodora. It's a topic I know very little about, and I'm excited to learn about it. And our guide for this next side quest will be Madeleine Duperouzel. Madeleine Duperouzel, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's a balmy 42 degrees where we are now, which is
Wow.
wonderful compared to the teens and low 20s that we had been dealing with. So I will take it. Of course, this is January. I'm not sure when this is going to post, but the last couple of weeks have been very cold. I hope the weather is better wherever you are.
I mean, no, but it's England. You get used to it.
We were really lucky. We went last summer and it was nice and warm the entire time. It was
Yeah.
like never overcast. It was we were very fortunate.
Yeah, last summer was lovely actually. But I mean, I don't know. Like you said, it's January. You get used to it, right?
Right. We'll see if our luck holds when we go to Scotland this summer. So
Oh.
not too
I'm
optimistic.
not sure I'd hold out hope, honestly.
Yeah, it was funny when we were in Ireland a couple of years ago, it did not rain until like the last day, which was really
Wow.
surprising. Yeah, so I think we're either going to have three really lucky trips or we're about to run out. So
Mm, yeah. Well, I'll keep my fingers crossed for you.
I will take all the help I can get. Um, as you may know, here on the podcast with first time guests, I like to tell people, give people a chance to tell their origin story
Mhm.
and tell the audience how it is that they ended up studying what we broadly call the classics.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not originally a classicist. I'm a historian by training. I did my undergrad degree here at Oxford in history, and I kind of fell into Byzantium accidentally, I suppose, or the Eastern Roman Empire. I was doing a paper which I found unbelievably boring in medieval history, and I was very keen to kind of get it over and done with, move back onto, the modern world and think about what I thought was real history. And I had to write an essay on the Alexiad by Anna Komnene, and I was just kind of blown away. I thought this is so interesting. It's written by a woman in the 1100s. I can't believe that something so kind of historically rich from a woman exists. And I was like, I need to know more. I need to find out more. And that led me down a path of basically never thinking about anything but Byzantine studies for the past, gosh, must be almost a decade now. And yeah, so then I did an MPhil in late antique and Byzantine studies at Oxford again. I took a bit of time out to work at an art gallery. I came back and I did a MA in art history, in Byzantine art history. And then this year I've just started my DPhil in 6th century Byzantium.
And so I think we have a little bit different terms over here, but that's what we would call a doctorate.
Yes, a doctorate, PhD.
Gotcha. I'm just curious because I came into people who've listened have heard this before, but I came into the classics in my 30s. I
Mm,
also had a degree in history for my undergrad, modern Cold War era American politics.
mm.
So I have no language background that's necessary. Um,
Yeah.
as I'm realizing, did you have that same kind of an issue? And if so, how did you deal with it?
Yeah, so that was a big one for me. I grew up in Asia. The only language background I had at all was Chinese. So starting my MPhil, it was quite a intensive language program. So I was doing the Greek language stream, and it went uh, to varying degrees of success at various points across that MPhil. I'm still getting really I think um, to grips with Greek, and looking at potential other languages that I need to think about over the course of my doctoral study. But yeah, the language background thing is big, and it's really tough. I think Oxford and a couple of other universities in the UK do a good job of kind of putting you on an intensive program, but definitely for an outsider, I mean, it's changing as the field gets more and more kind of public traction, but I think it is hard to access if you don't have that language background.
And so the other language is beyond Greek, because I was thinking about that when you were explaining your educational history. Obviously, Greek would be the most important, but are you also looking at any sort of Latin or Arabic overlap, or what are you looking at?
Yeah, so depending on how my research goes, pretty much over this next term, which is when I have to present kind of the structure of what I'm going to do for the next couple of years, I'll either be pursuing Latin or Arabic next year. I just kind of need to decide if I want to look backwards, which would be Latin, or look forwards, which would be Arabic. But yeah, I'm kind of hoping that it's Latin because now that I'm in the kind of Greco-Latin mindset, I think I'll find that a bit easier. Apparently, Arabic is just like a big one. So yeah, but we'll see. I've got to, present my research and figure out how valid it is at this stage.
And so, what are you studying now? What are you primarily focusing on now?
So, kind of in a broad sense, I look at the 6th century, and I mean kind of the long 6th century by that, which is about the reign of Anastasius through to about the reign of Heraclius. And that's definitely kind of my period and where I have the most knowledge. And then within that, I'm looking a lot at nature and the way that nature relates to society and to culture. And increasingly, I'm kind of drawing studying women into that and thinking about women in specific environments and landscapes and thinking about how we can understand femininity and female agency through a relationship to nature.
And as part of that, because I found you on the Blue Sky,
Yeah.
can you tell us how you became a an unapologetic Theodora stan?
Yeah, so that's kind of my jokey take on what is I think quite a serious relationship with Theodora as a historical figure. I got to know Theodora through doing this second paper that I did in my second year of university on the Near East and the age of Justinian and Muhammad. And I think the thing that I loved so much was that you couldn't, I think, study or understand Justinian without having a background in who Theodora was and how influential she was over him and over the entire course of that history. And I think that the more time that I spend in the discipline, I kind of I feel like I'm growing closer to her and who she might have been, but also you feel like I feel like I'm being led down this strange paradoxical rabbit hole and I'm chasing her, kind of like through the mist. And I'm just like desperate to uncover more about her, but wonder how far we'll ever get to kind of the real Theodora, I suppose.
And you know what's interesting was I had on Thursday, I had a discussion about Seneca and his
Mhm.
letters and some of the history of Seneca. And we were talking about some of the rumors that kind of dogged him and whether it's true and where you find these sources. And I was thinking about that as we were coming up on starting the interview this morning, as it relates to the different historical discussions we have about Theodora. But also, I was thinking about modern history. You would think that we would be able to simplify it because we have a greater written record and it'd be easier to understand things. But I don't know how future historians will deal with these sort of online Twitter rumors about Jennifer
Yeah.
Aniston and Barack Obama, or this Pizzagate nonsense that gets started on Facebook and
Yep.
Q and I mean, it just how how the next several generations of historians look back at this and try to comprehend that will be. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult it's going to be for them.
I know. It's not definitely not a task that I envy at all.
Right.
Sometimes it's a blessing and a curse, I think, being in the time period that I'm in. Um, Sometimes you're like, if I just had that just one more source, I might be able to piece this together. But at the same time, I mean, like we'll probably discuss with Procopius, sometimes that one more source can completely throw the balance, and you're just like, where am I gonna look at this?
Right, right. And that is a great segue into Theodora. Let's go ahead and start talking about her, and we can go into
Wonderful.
these in more detail later. But what are the main primary sources that we have for her?
So obviously the big one is Procopius's works. She's mentioned to varying degrees in all three that we have. So there's the Wars, which is his kind of uh, very traditional kind of sanitized overview of the history of Justinian's reign and his government, and it very much focuses on the military exploits of his chief general Belisarius. Um, and Procopius was the secretary of Belisarius and potentially a confidant as well. And so he was very much a first-hand witness to a lot of the stuff that was happening that he's recounting in the wars. And Theodora is mentioned there. She's mentioned very briefly in his other text, which is called On the Buildings of Justinian, which is basically an extended encomium of all the building works that Justinian does and doesn't do across the course of the empire. And
Weird.
he it's a very weird. I think it's actually his weirdest text, to be honest. Um,
I mean, I get why you built stuff, but why also in the things you didn't build. I mean, that okay,
yeah,
whatever.
it presents a lot of historiographical problems. But then, of course, I think the kind of biggest body of information that we have about Theodora is the secret history. And this is the very vitriolic invective that Procopius writes to sort of rhetorically dismantle and deconstruct the reign of Justinian. The motivation behind which remains obscure, and there's lots of conjecture about that. But he spends a lot of time skewering Theodora and her relationship to Justinian, Justinian's relationship to her. And this is where we get most of the information that we think is probably true about Theodora's early life and kind of her operation as a political actor.
Well, let's make sure we cover the thought about how much of it is true, because I've been having some thoughts of that as somebody who's coming to the classics kind of self-taught and some
Mm.
ideas of how we should view some things that are probably nonsense once you get exposed to more things, but whatever. Let's talk about her background.
Yeah.
I kind of titled this in my mind From Dancer to Empress. What do we know about her early life, and then take us up to when she gets into Justinian's realm?
So we know that Theodora is the daughter of a member of the Green faction, and so the Blues and the Greens are the circus factions that dominate kind of the entertainment of Constantinople through the Hippodrome races. And there are some suggestions that they were political actors and that they also had religious affiliations, and they were definitely pretty influential in the history of the city and civic participation in imperial politics. So Theodora's father, it's said by Procopius, is a bear keeper. This would have meant that he was just responsible for kind of bringing animals into the amphitheater or into the hippodrome for entertainment. And he dies when she's quite young, and she is left with her two sisters and her mother in a kind of difficult financial situation. And it's supposedly this that prompts her mother, who was also a dancer, to bring Theodora and her sisters into the world of dancing and acting and the theatre in Constantinople. Um, we can assume this is true. It tracks across other contemporary sources that Theodora had this kind of background. Whether or not, the specificities of it are accurate, that it seems kind of illogical that Procopius would just like make up that her father was a bear keeper and her mother was also an actress. We also know that um, often in that acting world, the profession tended to be passed down from mother to daughter. So it would make sense with Theodora's background that her mother was also an actress and her sisters were too.
Yeah, and it looked like in some of the other discussion of it that there was some kind of argument that she had perhaps been a prostitute. There were some discussions about Leda and the Swan and that performance, which we can get into in a minute. But I wonder, and I'm just curious what you think, if it's translation error about prostitute actress or overlap like Romulus and Remus instead of a wolf. It could have
Mhm.
been that term for prostitute was similar. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it is an interesting question. I think what it reflects is kind of a wider problem in late antiquity where you have a lot of um for example, like legal definitions, which are badly translated into the kind of more literary fields. So there was multiple terms for someone who would have been an actress or a prostitute, or a sex worker. We know that there was a lot of overlap between women who worked in the theatre and women who were sex workers. Um, a good way to think about it would be kind of like a burlesque show, right? People would go to these kind of raunchy entertainments, and then afterwards they might solicit services which went beyond just watching the women perform on stage. And certainly this was part of elite male culture to participate in this. The performance of Later in the Swan kind of comes into that as part of this uh, classical storytelling that is part of the education of these elite people that is then being kind of performed in a more erotic and not quite as elite way. So that there is confusion between that. They don't have specific terms that we can necessarily align exactly with our conceptions of what a modern sex worker would be. But Theodora definitely was participating in a culture that we might think of helpfully in a kind of burlesque way. And there's no reason really to doubt that some of the claims that Procopius makes, given what we know contextually about other sex workers at that time, that Theodora wasn't participating in that.
Yeah, it's interesting to try to reconcile those two texts, the wars and the secret history,
Mm,
mentally. But I'm also curious how much of some of the invective that's there. Like I think Procopius mentioned that um, Theodora was pregnant frequently, but she could induce immediate abortions.
mm.
How much of that is just kind of men being threatened by women who have agency or are treated outside of maybe the norms of what male female cultural expectations are at the time?
I mean, the whole Procopius's whole text as it comes to women is I think about a fear of female agency and about a fear of what the unnaturalness of female participation in political life entails. Theodora's background lends him a very helpful basis to construct that attack. Um, I think that you can't really understand the text without seeing that, but at the same time, the reason why Procopius's attacks would have had efficacy is because they would have been rooted in a lot of reality. And it was appealing to a specific audience that had familiarity with these women, potentially employed the services of women like Theodora, may have seen Theodora perform themselves. And that's what lent it so much force and so much power. Um, and I think it is hard because on one hand, you want to read the text and be like, what we're seeing here when we read between the lines of this vitriolic, quite sexist attack is a woman who is exerting agency over her own life and making choices and decisions and, at times taking pleasure in what she does, whether that's in her early career as a performer or in her later career as an empress, but also who clearly has been really the victim of a very vicious patriarchal system, which abuses children and women for the entertainment of powerful men. Um, and it is tricky to reconcile. And I think bringing it in with the wars, I kind of I understand why it feels like they're conflicting. I do think that even in his portrayal in the Wars of Theodora, when he talks about the fantastic speech that she gives, where she says she won't abandon the city, that royalty is a good burial shroud during the 532 Nika riots. And she sort of opens that with a statement that she knows she's a woman and she knows she's not supposed to be saying these things, but she's going to do it anyway. We read that and I'm personally kind of like girl boss. Um, but I think the audience that Procopius would have been appealing to would have been pretty horrified by that. And the reason for its inclusion in the text is to activate that horror in that audience.
Yeah, well, I was thinking when you were describing how there's some truth to it, I was thinking back to The Hobbit and the Ring of Truth to
Mm.
Bilbo's story, as Gandalf mentioned. But for some reason, I can never pass up a chance to make that reference. I don't know why. But I think I may have watched the animated Hobbit movie with John Huston as Gandalf too much as a child. But we're not going to detour into John Huston movie endings here. but I would love to have that conversation with someone about
Yeah.
how awesome it is that a director was so great that he got a literal ending style of a movie named after him, but we'll deal with that later. But I wonder too how much of what he's writing is just maybe we should look at it as historical fiction in which it's framed. And I was thinking about this as I was reading the Iliad and the Aeneid,
Mm.
and I've got to get to the Odyssey at some point. But there's all right, there's known historical facts that occurred, but you're embellishing the details surrounding it. So it's got some idea of cultural reference points that the readers will be able to identify with, but it's not all true. That's just kind of how I'm trying to work through some of these things in my mind. Is that kind of a way to process maybe some of the secret history?
Yeah, I mean, no, definitely a big way to think about it is the fact that he's relying on kind of pre-existing cultural paradigms to construct an image that has a basis in reality, but is not reflective of the entirety of reality. But I think that the thing that's important from that reading is less the fact that we can identify that it wasn't all true, and more the fact that these cultural paradigms have to grow from somewhere. And I think the thing that perhaps is the most interesting thing about Theodora to me is that it's kind of through her elevation to the highest office that a woman could hold in the land, in the world, that she kind of pulls up the women who would otherwise be lost to history with her. It's through Procopius's sustained attack on her that we find some idea of kind of maybe some of the horrors that existed and some of the traumas that were being inflicted on women and children during this period, and that whose voices we just don't get to hear otherwise. Um, there's one pretty horrific quote in The Secret History, which always turns my stomach a little bit, where Procopius is talking about Theodora first coming into performing at the theatre. And he says that she's is so long before her puberty that she's not able to take on the role of a woman as a woman normally should in these kinds of relations. And what we infer from this is that she's taking on um, anal penetration as a child. And even if this didn't necessarily
Let me
happen,
go throw up for a few minutes
it's
here.
it's
Ugh.
it's horrifying. It's horrifying. It's really, it's I'm a bit like sweaty talking about it, right? Um, but even if Theodora herself didn't experience this, this is enough of a touchstone that Procopius is able to reference this happening. We can assume, and also there's enough legal source material, especially that's issued by Justinian trying to outlaw this kind of practice, to know that this is something that's going on, and that the trafficking of young children, not just girls, but young boys as well, is a common occurrence in these circles. So, I think that it's not just about the attack on Theodora. It's not just about what Procopius says about Theodora. It's about the fact that through that, we are learning so much about how power and abuse functions and about how sex work functions. And that's why those kinds of attacks become really harrowing but interesting as well.
Wow. Mm, come on, history. Help.
Yep.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
Well, so one thing that I'm going to take a while to get to my point here as I try to mentally process that.
Yeah.
So she obviously Theodora ends up becoming Justinian's wife and Empress. How did that happen? How did she land in the imperial court? And do we have any idea how common or uncommon that was for someone of sort of a nondescript social background to get to the top?
I mean, I'll start by saying Theodora was hugely uncommon and abnormal in a sense, and I think also that's what lends a lot of credence to Procopius's attacks. Men of the kind of senatorial elite, which Justinian was by the point that he met Theodora, because his uncle was the Emperor Justin the First, were permitted to have relationships with courtesans. They were permitted to have mistresses, but they were not permitted to marry them and have legitimate children with them. And uh, it was at Justinian's behest, probably, that Justin the First changed this law and allowed his nephew to marry Theodora. So, we can see just from that piece of evidence that this was really uncommon and not normal. And there would have been a lot of people who were really unhappy about this situation coming to pass. Prior to this happening, though, we have kind of again shaky ground with Theodora. We know that she is the mistress of a man who ends up becoming the governor of Libya, in North Africa. She follows him there. He abandons her for whatever reason. Potentially he wanted to marry and have legitimate children. I imagine maybe there was some kind of conversation happening between them where she wanted more from him and he was refusing to break those kind of societal stereotypes and give her a better life. Whatever happens, he kind of abandons her. She makes her way to Egypt, and Procopius tells us, as she's getting from Libya to Egypt, she's engaging in all the same kinds of things she'd been doing in Constantinople. She's putting on these shows and these performances. She's being a sex worker. She's having sex solicited from her by men. However she gets there, there's historians who speculate that it's in Egypt that she first starts thinking theologically about Miaphysitism, which is the non-Chalcedonian form of Christianity that's in competition with Orthodox Christianity during the reign of Justinian. And Theodora is quite an influential proponent of a lot of major Miaphysite figures when she comes to the throne. So we can kind of speculate that it's in this context that she starts thinking more intensely about Christianity. And I like to think that this is where she becomes like quite a self-sufficient person, and where she forms a lot of her intellectual background that I think will be the reason why she's able to form such strong connection with Justinian when she finally meets him. She makes enough money to get back to Constantinople. And again, we get the story that she's back at her old tricks. Supposedly, Justinian sees her when she's putting on one of her performances and falls kind of thunderclap instantly in love. I think it's more likely that she's using a lot of the tactics that she learnt whilst being another powerful man's mistress, engaging with political players to get herself closer to the center of power. I think that just from the later information that we have from her, we can read quite a cunning and intriguing political mind. And yeah, probably her skills as a performer are coming into that. But I do think that she's actively leveraging herself closer to power. And I think that's the context in which she probably meets Justinian.
Well, I guess it makes sense that Justinian may not have as many concerns about the established social order because his family kind of came from a peasant background, as they say, and wasn't part of the elite. So it may not be as big of a concern for them. But as I had read David Parnell's book about Belisarius, and talked with him about this and some of my research for today, it really seemed like there was a partnership between Theodora and Justinian and that they actually worked together. Am I misreading that? Is that accurate?
I think it's 100% accurate. I mean, every single source, I think from the legal through the visual, through the written sources, everything seems to emphasize that Justinian and Theodora were not only completely obsessed with each other and in love with one another, but were working together in partnership. I think that Justinian listened very seriously to what Theodora said. I think that, again, this forms the basis of a lot of the sustained attack that Procopius engages in on as regards Justinian himself. And we might take that as kind of a, there's always, I feel like political commentators love the suggestion that a man is being influenced by his wife, his kind of scheming, conniving wife. That's a stereotype through history.
See Hillary Clinton's treatment.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
the ancient roots of that are pretty phenomenal. But the fact is that we have legal sources from Justinian, which I don't know if we'd read them as progressive per se, but which are definitely dealing with issues that we know that Theodora was related to in some way, and that would normally kind of be out of the purview of an emperor's legislation. Like you see in Constantine, a bit of inclination towards legislating for women to have a few more rights as relates to inheritance and in relation to marriage and remarriage. These kind of solidify under Theodosius with the Codex Theodosianus, which has to do with the rise of Christianity. But Justinian seems to really take a lot of these causes to heart. There's harsher penalties for rape. There's real attempts to try and outlaw especially the child sex trafficking that's taking place. And I think that we can read Theodora's influence into this. I don't know if she ever gave that speech before Justinian was meant to flee during the Nika riots, but the fact of the matter is, in a major political text, which is what the wars is, an account of a government, a major role is given to Theodora in preventing the downfall of the government, and I think we should take that seriously. So I think that calling it a partnership is reading what happened in history. And I mean, when we look at the visual sources, there are those beautiful mosaics in Ravenna, which are the ones that come up, on basically any book cover about the period. And artistically, Justinian and Theodora are portrayed in exactly the same way. They are portrayed as equals. They are looking at one another in the Basilica di San Vitale. And I think that this reflects the commonly held view that they were true partners throughout the empire.
It's interesting what you had said about the increased penalties for rape. And I remember this from when I was in law school. I don't think
Mm,
I've shared this on the podcast before. I took a course on the death penalty in America and
mm,
worked in a clinic that dealt with. We provided legal research for death penalty cases in Virginia. We joked that we were so effective at it in our clinic that we eventually put the death penalty out of business here in the Commonwealth. But one thing that was interesting when we were talking about the death penalty for rape was there were organizations. This is kind of really, I was thinking about it. It's kind of a sexist term to call them women's organizations or
mhm,
women's issues or whatever. Like it doesn't impact all of us, but yeah. But it was an interesting discussion about how there is a long history of using death penalty for rape as a way of enforcing women's status as property,
mm,
which I've always made a mental property of men, which I've
mm.
always made a mental note to study, but I've never gotten around to. But I think that I'd be curious about some of the historical treatment of that and views on that in antiquity. But that's always something that's been in the back of my mind. Um, I guess, and people who listen to this don't at me if I'm using the term wrong, but it seems like in many ways Theodora is like an OG or proto-feminist, that she was very much kind of changing perceptions on things. I mean, how should we view it? It's hard to view somebody with terms that we use today, but how comfortable of a fit is that?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think that I think that from a starting point, as responsible modern historians, one of the first lenses that we should take to studying Theodora and Justinian's reign should be a feminist one. That doesn't mean, however, that I think that we could call Theodora a feminist. I think that it's too loaded and it doesn't quite address the nuances of her position, of the kinds of legislation and action that was produced and taken under Justinian's reign. It's the feminist lens helps us think about things like the lives of the other sex workers that Theodora worked with. It helps us envision how male writers were attacking her or structuring her in their texts, or even how those texts reflect conversations that may have been taking place in the court while Theodora was empress. But to call Theodora herself a proto-feminist, I think, it's not like she's saying women should be emancipated from men, right? She's saying, I think that women who want to reform themselves from a life of sin, which is how the idea of sex work is referred to in the Justinianic legislation, can do so by, joining a nunnery, or which she's trying to offer rehabilitation options for women, but it's not like actually like freeing women from that or attacking the cycle per se. And Justinian was pretty keen on cracking down on the child sex trafficking, absolutely. But he doesn't go that far to kind of, stop prostitution and improve the lives of prostitutes. Because something that we have to remember is that actually prostitution was very profitable. Prostitutes throughout various stages of the Roman Empire paid tax, and they paid quite a bit of it. They were portrayed always as being kind of bedecked in jewels and silk, so we know that they had tangible economic assets attached to them. So there's an interest that goes beyond just, ideals of womanhood or redemption from sin that's tied up in this as kind of more practical economic concerns. And I think for that reason, I mean, the nature of sex work itself is nuanced and complicated. But for that reason, associating Theodora with a kind of proto-feminism is tricky. But I don't think we can read her without a feminist lens. I don't know if that makes sense or if I've just rambled a bit, but
That actually does make sense because I think you can at least understand her as somebody who was a challenge in many ways, threat. I don't know if that's too strong a word, but perceived as a threat by many people in the established social order,
mm,
which I think goes back to, hey, you have to look at this in the way that we look at things historically with a feminist lens. But again, you can't really transplant
yeah.
modern terms and fit them nicely in the past at all times. So that does make a lot of sense. Your comment about prostitution being profitable and an economic accepted economic part of society. As I've been spending more time on academia.edu, I have come across some interesting articles about Athenian prostitution laws,
Mm,
and there's a whole world out there legally that I had no idea about that's just fascinating
mm.
uh, to look into and learn more about. But I want to ask you a little bit more about her her time as Empress and her perception by people in the ruling class and the elites.
Mm.
Did they always look down on her? Did it change over time? Did the secret history get distributed to anybody to, have some of this negativity in real time when she was alive? Do we know anything about that?
Um, I mean, this is like the question of the historiography around the secret history and around Theodora's reign and Justinian's reign. Um, I, I the problem is I subscribe on different days to a different view about what I think the secret history did and what it was intended to do and where it was intended to go. I think that I'm so easily persuaded by a well-written argument from an established scholar that they could, Anthony Caldelus's argument that he made, and I love Anthony Caldelus. He's, I think, a huge inspiration to me and to what Byzantine studies should be aspiring to more generally. Um, but he wrote an article very, I think, not early in his career, but sort of just before he kind of took off a bit, where he said that the secret history was potentially distributed amongst like a network of kind of neo-pagans. And that there was this like secret elite conspiratorial network of Constantinopolitan senators like Procopius who weren't Christian, who were reading these kinds of texts, and this was meant as a kind of maybe pagan attack on Justinian's reign. And I actually thought that was very convincing, and I enjoyed it reading it. But then at the same time, I've been persuaded by arguments that this is kind of just a rhetorical exercise, and Procopius is participating in a very established system of critique of government. You provide a panegyric or a history, and then at the same time, you are capable of providing something like an invective. And maybe that would have been distributed after Justinian's death. Maybe there was a period where we don't have enough source material where it seemed like really Justinian was on the out and it wasn't very popular to associate yourself with him. And Procopius was a close associate of the reign. He was with Belisarius, and Belisarius was Justinian's right-hand man in a lot of senses. It could have been to save his own skin for some reason that we can't quite ascertain. Part of the problem with the secret history, of course, being that we don't know how to date it in relation to his other works. So a lot of, and I'm actually won't get into it because the dating arguments confuse me so much, and I find that scholarship really like convoluted and complicated. But what we know is that it's hard to date the secret history. So because of that, we can't align it with any specific event. That makes building an argument out of that difficult.
Well, it's interesting so the way that you've talked about it takes me back to my initial thought on the secret history, which was uh, for those of you who may know a little bit about United States Senate Supreme Court confirmation hearings, there was someone put up during the Reagan administration, Robert Bork, and he was asked some questions about rights to privacy, the Ninth Amendment to the United States Constitution, what that all means. And he gave a very interesting answer to it. And before you can kind of understand that, the Ninth Amendment reads, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. So other rights retained by the people is a constant confusing. What the heck does this mean? And Robert Bork was asked about it, and he says, I do not think you can use the Ninth Amendment unless you know something of what it means. For example, if you had an amendment that says Congress shall make no, and then there is an ink blot and you cannot read the rest of it, and that is the only copy you have, I do not think the court can make up what might be under the ink blot if you cannot read it. So now listening to what you just said brings me back to the ink blot example, and in some ways that's what's at play there. But I still find it fascinating in what it kind of conveys about how people thought about women, people from her background. Can you walk us through? You mentioned a little bit about the Nika riots and the legislation and the legal reforms that she was involved in.
Mm.
But can you tell us kind of what else she's known for, what else she's remembered for?
I mean, primarily it is those kinds of things because that is what the sources prioritize. We also we can glean from the wars that she was pretty if not influential, then present in kind of major um events that were taking place in the court. The example that comes to mind is when I think he's the I'm gonna get this wrong. I don't know my barbarians well enough. I think he's the former leader of the Vandals, Galima, and he is taken to Constantinople after Belisarius has defeated the Vandalic kingdom, and he's made to give kind of abeyance to Justinian. And we know that Theodora is present there, and she is said by Procopius to be part of the decision making behind giving Galima lands in Galatia and kind of the almost like the the preservation of this former enemy of the states status in a way. I think probably he's being bought off a little bit, trying to be made into an ally of the state. And I've found that passage really interesting because to me it seems like there's this level of diplomatic power and intervention that Theodora exercises, and certainly she's hearing what's going on and making informed decisions about that, and is making, she's not just thinking about what's happening with former sex workers in the capital. She's thinking about how do we deal with kings of other states who have been defeated, who are now subservient to us again, and she's part of that decision-making process. So this is what I mean when I talk about Theodora as the political actor and the political agent. I think that we can see this level of participation and also genuine adeptitude and competency at doing this. And then, of course, the other big example is which is mentioned in both the wars and the secret history, which makes me think it's really true, which is that she absolutely hates this guy called John the Cappadocian, and he was the Praetorian prefect of the East for a while. And it's probably likely that Theodora was annoyed at how much influence he was having over Justinian, or at the very least felt like she was potentially being sidelined, or that John the Cappadocian was was doing a lot to try and sideline her. Procopius says outright in the wars that he would kind of go to Justinian and like say bad things about Theodora directly to Justinian, which is insane given the nature of their partnership. So Theodora conspires with her friend Antonina, who is Belisarius's wife, and another woman who receives quite sustained attack in the secret history at Procopius's hands. Um, they conspire to essentially kill John the Cappadocian, which doesn't happen, but he ends up having a fall from power and a fall from grace. She works with Belisarius and also the eunuch general Narses, who's a very important figure in Justinian's reign. He is, along with Belisarius, responsible for the conquering of the former territories in Italy. In I think that's the 530s. I'm not great on the reconquest stuff. That's my kind of, that side of the empire at that point. I'm not thinking about too much.
Yeah, what's left of it?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so she's not only kind of present in a more public setting, like with the subservience of the Vandal king formally to Justinian, but she's also participating in political intrigue behind the scenes and making sure that someone with undue influence is going to be kept in check and that her position or the position of her allies isn't compromised.
So she, spoiler for everybody, she passes away. All right, just in case you were curious. She passes away. How much time elapses until we see a similar Empress with that level of agency, that level of involvement? I mean, and I'm asking this, and I apologize, this was not on the outline to be prepared for, so I'm sorry, but I know very little about Eastern Roman history. Once you get past the West and the, I don't want to get into the whole when did it fall debate here. I'm not
Really?
doing that.
Yeah.
But I know very little about the Eastern Roman Empire, so I'm just curious, when do we see someone like her again make an appearance?
I mean, the thing is, I think the thing that's is great about what Theodora does and the way that her legacy is perceived is that she does provide a kind of precedent for later empresses who come after her. She through acting in a political way, I think she legitimizes not only female agency but female ambition. Not long after Justinian dies. So you have, I'm so bad at this period. You have Justinian's death in 565. Then you have, I think, the reign of Tiberius, and then you have the reign of Justin II. And Justin II is married to a woman called Sophia, and she is the first empress to be depicted on a coin alongside her husband. And it's broadly accepted that Justin II probably experienced some form of mental illness, potentially a form of dementia, potentially a form of schizophrenia or bipolar. We're not exactly sure. The sources just kind of say like he goes mad. But Sophia essentially kind of acts as a bit of a regent while he's indisposed and makes a lot of important political decisions. I don't actually know enough about Sophia, but I know that that she does do this. And then as you get into the kind of post Islamic conquest period, and you have the iconoclastic controversy, which is in itself one of those did it happen, did it not happen questions that's not worth addressing. But the person who comes out on top at kind of the very end of all of that is another empress called Irene. I always get confused between the empresses in this period. And she very much acts with agency, and I think I forget if it's her or another Theodora, but one of them deposes their own son and tries to keep their own son off the throne. So, it's again pretty pretty ballsy from
Look,
these ladies.
okay, this morning before this, my wife and I went to work out at the gym at the school she works at, which is where our son goes to school.
Mm.
And Our son's 16. He drove over there and it's very cold out and he left one of the windows down in the van that he drove over there. So, I get it. I get it. Sometimes your sons just they aren't ready for things.
They're not ready for power, and
He he
they
had a
need
dance.
lessons.
Yeah, he was coming back from a dance last night and somehow this bow tie that he had on was out in the driveway in the yard. So,
Yep.
I mean, or in the back of the house. So sometimes you're just not ready.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this was the point that I'm really tempted to Google it because I don't want any listeners who might be more well versed in the iconoclastic period to come after me. I'm gonna say I think it's Irene. But yeah, she knew more. She was a more capable actor than her son, and she was kind of constrained by what her husband had said about the son inheriting the throne, and she was like, no, this won't stand. And I can do it just as well, if not better, and was better in many ways. So
Well, maybe she had one of those experiences, like why is the window left open? You know,
exactly. I'm
just
sure there was one thing that just it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and she was like, nah, not again.
yeah. So that yeah, I'm not necessarily advocating in any stretch. Well, I'm not advocating in any stretch that it's okay to depose your own son. Okay. However, I'm saying I understand as a parent the sentiment gives rise to that action. You just don't act on it. Okay. So, but anyway, shift gears a little bit. I
Mm.
mentioned you're on the Blue Sky. Where can we keep up with you online? How can we find you on the socials or on the interwebs?
Blue Sky is my big one. That's I think I'm M Duperouzel or something on Blue Sky. And that is, yeah, kind of my main immediate form of discourse with the public about history, which I'm trying to build and develop. And then I also have a Substack, which I'm just getting off the ground, rather ambitiously called Empress of Byzantium. So right now it's kind of a bit, I'm still figuring out exactly the kinds of things that I want to be putting on there, but I'm trying to write history beyond just the academic stuff that I have to do all day. History that's a bit more experimental or engaging or even just, not as nitty gritty as some of the stuff that I have to get into, which is at points gets really conceptual and technical. So yeah, it would be great to get more people engaging with that and getting. I think I have a little note which says, even if you hate my work, subscribe to argue with me. I'm always always open to hear some controversial opposing views. So yeah, those are my two main forms of social.
Folks, definitely subscribe to that. And the way that history is written and consumed is a very interesting topic. I've read some articles as part of doing this podcast where I have to just say, who in the world are you writing this for? It is so esoteric and hard to wrap itself around. And then you read, and again, I know that this book was written to justify war crimes and
Mm,
very biased. But if you read the translations of the Gallic War, Caesar's
mm,
approach of writing in a very simplistic narrative structure that's easy to consume and digest is advantageous for a reader. Um,
mm.
in my own line of work, I think about it as the difference between an appellate attorney and a trial attorney. I'm a trial attorney, so my primary arguments are to jurors who are going to have a short period of time to process information,
Mm.
as opposed to judges who are going to like to really jump into where is this comma place and what is a
Yeah.
dangling participle, and I have no idea, nor do I care. So that is something that I applaud you on if you're trying to make it more comprehensible and entertaining of a read for people. I know the term popular history people use, and I think that that's kind of an insulting terminology. I think it's
Yeah, I agree strongly on that. I think it makes it seem like what you're doing is not real history, and it
right.
is real history. But also I think it just kind of I think it limits you. I think that you within an academic context, you have to write in a specific way and you have to be technical and you have to provide a certain amount of specific traceable evidence. This is responsible academic practice. But when it comes to making history open to people, I think we can be a bit more creative. I think, even stuff that fictionalizes or imagines bits of history that we wouldn't otherwise have many sources on, I think is valid and really important. And just, it's not popular history. It's just a different way of doing history and a different way of speaking to historical audiences or people, so audiences interested in history and historical narrative. So yeah, I also dislike the term popular history greatly.
Well, history belongs to everybody, not just a group of people who have, and I don't want to be insulting here, but it's not just for people who are in academic centers.
Exactly.
And if you want people to be more informed about this, it has to be written in a way that is easy to consume and understand. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad writer.
No.
It's challenging to write well, and regardless of who your audience is.
Yeah.
And I've read, a number of different books as part of this that I think are very good examples of how you write to an audience, a broad audience, as opposed to a very narrow audience. So I applaud you in that. I salute you.
Thank you.
Fight the good fight. All right. Closing matters here. Give us a book recommendation. It can be any book that would be good to read. No, time period is not, or genre does not matter.
I mean, this was the question that I struggled with the most on the outline.
At least you remembered. Let me tell you, I so many people are like, wait, I have to recommend a book. Yes, it is there at the end. Right
You gotta
there.
keep scrolling.
Right.
So I mean, I'm gonna be really annoying and mention three for different reasons. The
That's
first
fine.
I've already said is the Alexiad by Anna Komnene. It was the text that first introduced me to Byzantium. I think that I could recommend one of Procopius's works, and if people want to read them, please, they're great reads, go and read them. But I like that the Alexiad, in a way, kind of represents a combination of the things that I've spoken about here today about female agency and its potential power in the Eastern Roman Empire and into medieval Byzantium. Secondly, totally unrelated to Byzantine studies, I read this year Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, which is phenomenal. Work of nonfiction about the ongoing confusion between Naomi Klein and Naomi Wolf, who is the kind of right-wing, slightly nutty personality, big Trumpist at the moment. And it's kind of it starts as a meditation on what it means to be confused with someone else, and it ends up as a very powerful exploration of the rise of the far right and of the, I suppose, unfortunately, very relevant themes that we're looking at with the next 4 years and the administration that's currently in charge. So really recommend that. And then thirdly, the book that I recommend to everyone all the time because it's my enduring, eternal favorite is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which is a medieval murder mystery and features some of the most, I think, memorable characters in Western literature.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. While some of the stuff that we talked about was unsettling and difficult to hear, this was a very informative talk. We learned a lot about how history and contemporaries treated a powerful and groundbreaking empress. Now, if you want to stay in touch with the podcast, go to the website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Check out the socials, either at Duke FB Coverage or at Antiquity Pod. Hey, why don't you give us a call? 540-632-0160. Leave a message and you'll get in an episode. Thanks to Brent Arehart, who put this wonderful theme music together. And stay tuned, folks. More episodes are coming because, as you know, Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.